In the last module, we learned about this concept of surveillance, this collection of data with respect to some sort of health aspect for the purposes of sharing that data and for the ultimate purpose of making good health decisions that reduce risk of morbidity and mortality for disease. If you remember back to the very first module, and the talk by Dr. Linda Murray about reporting for COVID in Black communities in Chicago, one of the things she said is how bad the data was and how that had a negative effect on them making good decisions. So it just really highlights how important surveillance is. Now, there's a lot of things that we can survey, but in this particular module, we're going to be speaking to the concept of surveillance of physical activity. Measuring physical activity is difficult for a number of reasons. First of all, it's hard to really capture in words or in amounts how much people exercise without directly measuring it. And even still, it's difficult to get really good data. Our frequency, intensity, and duration of physical activity can vary a lot between individuals. Plus, it can vary a lot from day to day, week to week, month to month as well. Also, the issue with measuring physical activity is that it's not one activity. There's complex movements going on in the body, and some people are going to, let's say, recruit different muscles or more muscles or activate them more intensely than others. So to have kind of a gold standard measurement of physical activity, which really captures how much we're moving our body and the effect it's having, it's really difficult to do. But you're going to see in this unit that we try, and it's still important to do even if we don't have perfect measures. But in this unit, we're going to go over some of the major ways of measuring physical activity and some of their advantages and disadvantages. So as a general rule, the better the measure of physical activity, the more expensive it is, the more equipment it needs, the more complex it is. And alternatively, the easier the method for measuring physical activity, like self-reports, for instance, the less likely it is to be accurate. Okay, the less likely it is to fully capture how much people are exercising. So again, it's just difficult to get good data on physical activity. When we talk about measuring physical activity, we ideally want our measure of physical activity to be all of these things, to be valid, accurate, reliable, and sensitive. So valid means that we are actually measuring what we're supposed to be measuring. So for instance, some heart rate monitors, they are going to estimate the amount of physical activity by measuring your heart rate. But then the question is heart rate a good measure or a good way of capturing how much physical activity people are getting? And it is decent, but that speaks to the concept of validity. Accuracy means how close are we? The value that we get, if we're saying people are getting X amount of physical activity or are burning X amount of calories, is that X close to the true X? Okay, so is it actually capturing how much people are moving? And these days, a lot of the ways we're measuring physical activity is with wearables and wearable technologies. And these are actually pretty decent. They're actually pretty accurate for the most part, but we're going to look into them a little bit further in a future unit, a future module. Reliability means that if I keep testing, if I keep using this, let's say, Apple Watch to monitor physical activity, is it always going to be able to capture it well? Okay, can I repeatedly measure it and measure it with accuracy and validity on repeated measures? Okay, and sensitivity, this looks to how well is it at capturing minor fluctuations or major fluctuations as well. So for instance, what we see with a lot of wearables is they're really good at certain intensities, but not so good at capturing physical activity or calories burned at, let's say, lower intensities. Okay, so some of these could be more sensitive. Something else to think about is how easy is this actual measure at administrating, and how costly is it as well. So these are some things that come up as far as measurement goes. Okay, so the gold standard for measuring physical activity is something called doubly labeled water. And when I say doubly labeled, I mean that I replace the hydrogen and the oxygen within a water molecule with certain isotopes for hydrogen and oxygen that I can track. Okay, and I basically track how much of that I was given to people, and at the end of a period of time, let's say a week, let's say 2 weeks, let's say 3 weeks, I measure how much usually carbon dioxide is released by that person, and that gives us a measure of, as it says here, the loss of carbon dioxide is closely related to oxygen consumption. So doubly labeled water is a very good way of measuring oxygen consumption as far as accuracy goes and validity goes, and reliability as well. However, it is expensive. It is, you need specialized material, and it's not just widely available. Something that you would see a little bit more frequently is something called indirect calorimetry, which basically measures oxygen consumption historically within a chamber, but there are newer devices, lightweight oxygen monitors that can also measure oxygen consumption. But again, these require specialized equipment. They require know-how of how to use them properly as well to get accurate data. So the technology is improving, but we're still not at a place where we could use indirect calorimetry or doubly labeled water at like the population level. Like if I want to know how much Canadians are, being active, neither of these are going to be good measures because they're just way too time consuming, require way too many things, and it's not going to be feasible to use them at a larger level. But for a personal level, individual level, they're really great measures. So because these measures are a little more complicated, we often measure physical activity with self-reports, either by surveys like mail-in or in-person, internet surveys, telephone surveys. We might conduct structured interviews, have them to do an exercise diary as well, maybe record their physical activity patterns for a day or a week or a year. And you're actually going to, in the next unit, we're going to look at something called the IPAC, the International Physical Activity Questionnaire, which is one of the types of surveys that does, self-reported surveys that does measure physical activity. But quite honestly, there are many problems with these self-reports. One of the issues is that people either lie or they just don't remember. Quite honestly, I filled out the IPAC yesterday just to practice with it myself, and I was like, wait, how many times was I moderately active? How many times did I do? How many minutes? I don't remember. I don't keep track of these things, So for some people, they'll remember like down to the minute how much they engage in moderate and vigorous and light physical activities, but a lot of us don't remember, and some people are going to lie as well. One of the main issues with self-reported data is they often over or under-report activity. And actually, I should have circled the over. They often over-report activity. So if you're hearing data about the physical activity patterns of, let's say, children or adults, if it's just the strict data without any adjustments, as a general rule, these reports often overestimate physical activity, and the actual true rate of physical activity is often quite lower. Okay? And like I said, one of the issues with measuring physical activity is that people don't know how to properly record it, and part of that might be due with them not knowing what a vigorous activity is versus a moderate one. And the IPAC tries to educate people about what these terms mean, but still it's sometimes hard to differentiate between if I go for a walk and I walk really fast, is that vigorous or is that still moderate? If I go for a walk and I go kind of strolling, where does that fit in? Is that moderate or is that more of a light amount of physical activity? So the issue with these poorly reported surveys, and I'll get to him in a second, is that there are a lot of inaccurate measurements like we just talked about. And if you have inaccurate measurements, you're often going to come to incorrect conclusions. So the more, sensitive and accurate your survey can be and reliable, and let's say valid, all of those things, the more likely we are to get good data. And if you have good data, we can make good decisions from that good data. Okay, so a good self-report, like I said, will have all of these things. They'll sensitive, reliable, valid. It'll also be easy to administer, but even still, we just get this data wrong. And here's a good example of, not surveilling physical activity, but before the 2016 American presidential election, there was so much polling going on. And, they said that it was pretty much going to be a landslide for Donald Trump's opponent, Hillary Clinton. And, these were the stories right after the election. How did the polls get it so wrong? These are organizations that are that's their job, to poll people, to accurately get data, and they still messed it up. And I wanted to use this example to really highlight how difficult it is to get good data, especially from self-reported measures. Okay, so ideally, when we are conducting our surveys, our self-reported surveys, we want the population to be representative. For instance, if we are trying to track the physical activity patterns of Canadians, we don't want to just, go with men or women over 60 or children under 18. We want a good mixture of sample population, that sample population is equal in demographics to that, and other factors, to that larger population as well. We ideally also want it to be stratified. So for instance, we can, let's say with those demographic groups, break them into their subcomponents. So we can talk about not just physical activity of Canadians, but we can also talk about physical activity of women, let's say 18 to 30 or whatever else, right? So we can capture what's going on in those smaller groups compared to the larger population too. And of course, like any good data set, we want it to be randomly sampled as well. A note about sample size: a general rule is the smaller the target group, the larger of a population, of a proportion of that target group that we want to sample. So for instance, if I am looking at BPK students, I want to look at the physical activity patterns of first year BPK students. Okay, I don't actually know how many there are. I should know this, but let's say there's 200 of them. Okay, I'm going to need a higher percentage of those students within my sample in order to get a valid data. And there's calculations to figure out how much, and that's beyond the scope of this course, but I would need more. My sample size, I'm not going to measure all 200 of those, okay, but of the people that I am going to measure, I'm going to need more to get a valid representation of their physical activity patterns. In contrast, if I'm looking at the physical activity patterns of Canadians, because that population is so large, I just need a small proportion of that population, less than 1%, in order to get a valid representation. Now, one of the main issues with surveys that we often see is the response rate. And actually we run into this when we're doing when you guys evaluate us at the end of the semester, one of the things we're always concerned about is how many people are actually answering it. Because if only 5% of the class answers it, that doesn't give me a representative sample, okay? So response rates, it's always a difficult thing. A typical response rate to unsolicited questionnaires, so let's say you just send out emails and say, answer this questionnaire, honestly, less than 5% are typically going to answer, okay? If it's well designed and targeted, an excellent response rate, which is actually still pretty low, is about 15 to 25% of that population that you are sampling. We used to sample a lot with telephone interviews or telephone surveys, but you'll notice that this is becoming, or you might notice that this is becoming less and less. And part of the reason is it's harder to target, let's say, younger people who are not going to answer their phone if there's a number that they don't recognize on their phone, right? Whereas older people, they're still more likely to have a landline and, let's say, answer the phone when someone calls. So a lot of newer surveys are coming out on the internet, and internet is a great way to conduct surveys for some reasons, but they do have disadvantages as well. So probably the best thing about doing an internet survey is that the data comes back electronically, so you don't have to enter it in anywhere. You'll still probably have to do something with the data, but it's already kind of ready to go. Okay, it's cheaper, it's quick, you can just do a mass email. You have to collect the emails first, perhaps, but if you already have, let's say, an email database that you can work from, they're pretty easy to run, okay? However, people are maybe not going to answer open-ended questions, or it's going to discourage them from answering them if it is an internet survey. It's harder to reach people that are more challenging with these internet surveys as well. If we don't time these surveys properly, there's a chance that we're going to send a survey at a time or a date where less people are going to answer it. Let's say right after Christmas, I'm not going to answer a survey. I probably won't anyway, but the timing of that survey delivery is important. And also people just, again, might lie because it's anonymous. They might be like, oh, I'll show them, and they might just really screw with the data. Okay, so these are things we need to keep in mind. Okay. So if you are conducting a survey, a self-reported survey for anything, some things that you might want to do to increase response rates and accordingly accuracy of the data that you get, you might want to let them know in advance. I did a survey with a fitness group once, and I worked with the person that worked with this fitness group, and we let them know in advance, hey, this survey is coming. It's really important for X, Y, and Z, and then when it came, they were prepared for it. But again, working with that person who that population trusted helped us administer that survey. We got like a 90% response rate on that one. Reminding them, I know we get so many reminders, but like these reminders can help people to actually get these things done. Using interesting questions, keeping it short. The longer it is, if I get an email that says a survey will only take you 30 minutes to complete, I don't got 30 minutes. If you tell me it takes 5 minutes to complete and I'm bored, I might fill it out. So it really depends, and it shows you here. So if it's 1 to 5 minutes, they're way more likely to complete it. If it's over 30, that really kind of dips down over that about 15-minute marks. That response rate is going to be pretty much abysmal if your survey is very long. So then it becomes a challenge to keep it short, but pick good questions that are really still going to capture what you're trying to capture. Okay, and it's a good thing what's in it for the respondents. So sometimes they'll be like, you could win, if you do the survey, you can win a $50 Amazon gift card or something like that. Something like that might help with response rates. So self-reported data is one way that we can survey a population to get a sense of what's going on for a particular health factor. However, they are difficult to get high response rates, and the accuracy of this data leaves a lot to be desired. Okay, so we're going to look also at wearable technology and how that can help us estimate physical activity within a population.